File edit. Chapter 1.md adding more content to reach the 10,500 character target for Chapter 1 old content. As Catherine concluded her opening remarks, Marcus allowed himself to imagine the satisfaction of watching Elena's face when the custody decision was announced. For too long, she had been a burden disguised as a partner, a dependent masquerading as an equal. Finally, the legal system would recognize what he had always known, that some people were natural leaders while others were natural followers, and that their daughters deserved to be raised by someone who understood the difference. New content. As Catherine concluded her opening remarks, Marcus allowed himself to imagine the satisfaction of watching Elena's face when the custody decision was announced. For too long, she had been a burden disguised as a partner, a dependent masquerading as an equal. Finally, the legal system would recognize what he had always known, that some people were natural leaders while others were natural followers, and that their daughters deserved to be raised by someone who understood the difference. The courtroom fell silent as Catherine returned to her seat, and Marcus felt the weight of expectation settling over the room like a heavy blanket. Everyone present understood they were witnessing what should be a straightforward case, a simple matter of a successful businessman seeking to protect his children from an inadequate mother. The evidence was overwhelming, the outcome predetermined. Elena closed her portfolio with a soft click that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet courtroom. For a brief moment, Marcus caught a glimpse of her notes, and something about the precise formatting and mathematical symbols scattered throughout the margins made him pause. The handwriting was clean and professional, with numerical calculations that appeared far more complex than anything he remembered her being capable of during their marriage. But such observations were quickly dismissed, as Catherine had taught him to do. Elena had probably copied formulas from somewhere without understanding their meaning, or perhaps her lawyer had coached her on how to appear more competent than she actually was. Marcus had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving, especially when someone was desperately trying to hide their inadequacies. Judge Hartwell's voice cut through the silence with the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that changed lives forever. We'll proceed with witness testimony after a brief recess. I want both parties to understand that this court's primary concern is the welfare of Isabella and Sophia Holloway, and every decision will be made with their best interests as the paramount consideration. As the judge departed, Marcus turned to Catherine with the confident smile of a man who knew he held all the cards. "This is exactly how we expected it to start," he said quietly. "Elena's lawyer looks completely outmatched, and she's just sitting there taking notes like a student in a lecture hall. By the time we're finished presenting our evidence, there won't be any question about who deserves custody." Catherine nodded, but her experienced eyes remained focused on Elena with the wariness of someone who had learned never to underestimate an opponent until the final verdict was read. Marcus followed her gaze and watched as Elena organized her papers with methodical precision, each document finding its exact place in a system that appeared far more sophisticated than random filing. The morning sun had shifted, casting different shadows across the courtroom floor, and Marcus realized that despite his confidence, something about Elena's demeanor was beginning to bother him. She seemed too calm, too prepared, too willing to let him destroy her reputation without mounting any meaningful defense. In 12 years of marriage, he had never known her to accept defeat so quietly, especially when their children were involved. File edit. Chapter 2.md adding more content to reach the 10,500 character target for Chapter 2 old content. Elena returned her attention to her legal pad, once again writing in those precise, confident strokes that Marcus was beginning to realize might represent something far more significant than random note-taking. As the morning progressed toward what should have been his inevitable victory, Marcus Holloway began to suspect that the woman sitting across from him might not be the helpless dependent he had spent 12 years believing her to be. New content. Elena returned her attention to her legal pad, once again writing in those precise, confident strokes that Marcus was beginning to realize might represent something far more significant than random note-taking. As the morning progressed toward what should have been his inevitable victory, Marcus Holloway began to suspect that the woman sitting across from him might not be the helpless dependent he had spent 12 years believing her to be. The implications of Elena's technical knowledge sent a chill through Marcus's carefully constructed confidence. If she understood current banking regulations well enough to catch errors that professional lenders had missed, what else might she know that he had assumed was beyond her comprehension? The systematic exclusion that had seemed so clever and protective now appeared potentially dangerous, like deliberately blinding himself to an opponent's true capabilities. Marcus's mother, Patricia, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her earlier satisfaction replaced by growing concern. She had always supported her son's decision to maintain complete financial control in his marriage, believing it demonstrated proper masculine leadership and feminine cooperation. But watching Elena calmly expose errors in professional financial documents suggested a competence that called their entire family narrative into question. Catherine attempted to regain control of the courtroom by introducing character witnesses who would testify to Marcus's superior parenting abilities and financial acumen. But Marcus found himself distracted by Elena's continued note-taking, wondering for the first time in their relationship what thoughts might be hidden behind her carefully neutral expression. The woman he had married had never challenged his decisions or questioned his expertise, but the woman sitting across from him today seemed to possess knowledge and confidence that he had never suspected existed. Judge Hartwell called for another brief recess, and Marcus realized with growing unease that what should have been a straightforward demonstration of his ex-wife's inadequacies had somehow become a more complex examination of assumptions he had never thought to question. Elena's quiet competence was beginning to cast shadows over everything he thought he knew about their marriage, their financial arrangements, and the woman who had shared his life for more than a decade. When court reconvened, James Rodriguez stood with a confidence that surprised everyone in the room, including Marcus. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Mrs. Catherine Morrison to the stand." Marcus frowned as he watched a distinguished woman in her 60s walk toward the witness stand. He didn't recognize her, which immediately put him on edge since Catherine's team had prepared him to expect only familiar faces who would reinforce Elena's supposed inadequacies. Catherine Morrison raised her right hand and swore to tell the truth, her voice clear and professional. Rodriguez approached the witness stand with renewed purpose, clearly working from notes that Elena had provided during their whispered conference. "Mrs. Morrison, could you please tell the court your professional background and how you know the defendant?" "I'm the director of the Riverside Community Center, where we offer financial literacy classes for adults returning to the workforce," Mrs. Morrison replied. "Elena Vasquez has been attending our evening sessions for the past 3 years, and I can say without hesitation that she demonstrates one of the most sophisticated understanding of financial principles I've encountered in 25 years of teaching." Marcus felt his stomach drop as the implications of this testimony began to register. Elena had been taking financial classes for 3 years without his knowledge, during the very period when their marriage was deteriorating and he was working late hours to expand his consulting business. The evenings when he thought she was attending book clubs or parent meetings, she had apparently been developing exactly the kind of expertise he had spent their entire marriage convincing her she could never possess. Catherine objected immediately, arguing that attendance at community college courses hardly qualified as professional financial education. But Judge Hartwell overruled the objection and instructed Rodriguez to continue his questioning. "Mrs. Morrison, could you describe the level of coursework that Elena completed in your program?" "Elena completed advanced modules in tax preparation, investment analysis, and business accounting," Mrs. Morrison testified. "She consistently scored in the top 5% of all students and demonstrated particular aptitude for complex calculations involving compound interest, depreciation schedules, and portfolio diversification strategies. In fact, she tutored other students who were struggling with concepts that she seemed to grasp intuitively." Marcus's business partner David Chen shifted uncomfortably in his seat as he realized that Elena had been acquiring exactly the kind of financial knowledge that Marcus claimed she was incapable of understanding. The systematic exclusion that had seemed so protective now appeared to have been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of Elena's actual capabilities and interests. Catherine rose for cross-examination, her voice sharp with frustration as she attempted to minimize the impact of Mrs. Morrison's testimony. These were basic community college courses, not professional certification programs. Anyone can memorize formulas and procedures without truly understanding their practical applications in real-world financial planning. Mrs. Morrison's response was measured but firm. "With respect, Counselor, Elena's final project involved creating a comprehensive financial plan for a hypothetical family with multiple income sources, variable expenses, and long-term educational goals. Her analysis included sophisticated risk assessment calculations and demonstrated understanding of tax implications that many professional advisors struggle to master. This was not memorization. This was genuine comprehension applied to complex problem-solving. Judge Hartwell leaned forward with obvious interest, her expression shifting from polite attention to focused scrutiny. Mrs. Morrison, in your professional opinion, would someone with Elena's demonstrated competency be capable of managing household finances, educational planning, and investment decisions for a family? Absolutely, Mrs. Morrison replied without hesitation. Elena possesses not only the technical knowledge, but also the analytical thinking skills necessary to handle complex financial responsibilities. I would trust her to manage my own family's finances based on the competency she demonstrated in our program. Marcus watched in growing alarm as his carefully constructed narrative began to crumble under the weight of evidence he had never anticipated. Elena had not only been educating herself in the very subjects he claimed she couldn't understand, but she had apparently excelled to a degree that impressed professional instructors. The woman he thought he had kept financially dependent had been systematically preparing herself for independence. When Mrs. Morrison stepped down, Rodriguez called his next witness, Dr. Michael Santos, a professor of economics at the local university. Marcus recognized the name from Elena's evening absences, though he had assumed she was attending some kind of support group rather than academic lectures. Dr. Santos testified that Elena had audited his intermediate economics course the previous semester and had submitted optional research papers that demonstrated graduate-level analytical skills. Catherine's objections became increasingly desperate as witness after witness contradicted the fundamental premise of Marcus's case. Elena had not been living in a bubble of financial ignorance. Instead, she had been methodically acquiring exactly the knowledge and credentials necessary to challenge every assumption about her supposed incompetence. Marcus felt his confidence evaporating as he realized that Elena had been planning for this moment far longer than he had suspected. While he had been focused on building evidence of her dependence, she had been building evidence of her competence. The systematic exclusion that he thought had protected his authority had actually motivated her to seek knowledge from sources he couldn't control or monitor. Judge Hartwell called for a brief recess, but instead of the confident discussion Marcus had expected to have with his legal team, he found himself facing uncomfortable questions about why he had been unaware of his wife's educational activities. Catherine's expression was grim as she realized that her entire strategy was based on information that might be fundamentally incorrect. Elena remained calm throughout the testimony, occasionally making notes, but showing no surprise at the revelations about her academic achievements. Marcus began to understand that her apparent submission during their marriage might have been a strategic choice rather than evidence of genuine incapacity. The woman he thought he had been protecting from complex financial decisions had apparently been studying those very subjects while he wasn't paying attention. When court reconvened, Rodriguez made an unexpected request. Your Honor, I'd like to ask the defendant to address the court directly regarding her understanding of the financial documents that have been presented as evidence of her incompetence. Catherine objected immediately, but Judge Hartwell was clearly interested in hearing what Elena had to say. Elena rose and approached the podium with the same calm composure she had maintained throughout the proceedings. Your Honor, I'd like to address the loan application that was submitted as Exhibit A. The document contains several calculations that appear incorrect, but the errors are not mine. They reflect outdated federal banking regulations that were superseded by Treasury Department guidelines issued in March of last year. Elena's voice was steady and professional as she continued. The interest rate calculation on line 14 uses a formula that was valid until the Federal Reserve adjusted their base lending requirements. The lending institution's analysis failed to account for these regulatory changes, which is why their initial rejection was later reversed by their compliance department. Marcus watched in stunned silence as Elena demonstrated not only knowledge of current banking regulations, but the confidence to challenge professional financial analysts in open court. This was not the woman he had married, or perhaps more accurately, This was the woman she had always been beneath the carefully constructed facade of financial dependence that he had encouraged and maintained. Judge Hartwell asked Elena to elaborate on several other documents, and with each response, Marcus's case grew weaker. Elena didn't just understand the technical details, she could explain their implications with a clarity that impressed even Catherine's experienced legal team. The systematic exclusion that Marcus had thought protected his authority had apparently freed Elena to develop expertise that now threatened to destroy everything he had worked to achieve. File edit. Chapter 4.md adding more content to reach the 9,000 character target for Chapter 4 old content. Judge Hartwell called another recess, but Marcus barely heard the announcement. He was too busy staring at Elena's calm, professional demeanor and wondering how many other assumptions about his marriage might be fundamentally wrong. The systematic exclusion that he had thought protected his authority was beginning to look like a catastrophic miscalculation that had blinded him to his wife's true capabilities while she systematically prepared to destroy every argument he planned to make against her. New content. Judge Hartwell called another recess, but Marcus barely heard the announcement. He was too busy staring at Elena's calm, professional demeanor and wondering how many other assumptions about his marriage might be fundamentally wrong. The systematic exclusion that he had thought protected his authority was beginning to look like a catastrophic miscalculation that had blinded him to his wife's true capabilities while she systematically prepared to destroy every argument he planned to make against her. As the courtroom emptied for the break, Marcus remained frozen in his seat, overwhelmed by the recognition that Elena had been playing a completely different game than the one he thought they were engaged in. While he had been collecting evidence of her supposed incompetence, she had been documenting his actual financial mistakes with the precision of a professional auditor preparing for the most important presentation of her career. File edit. Chapter 5.md adding a small amount of content to reach the 9,000 character target for Chapter 5 old content. The courtroom fell silent as the full scope of Marcus's miscalculation became apparent to everyone present. He had built his entire custody case on the premise that Elena was financially incompetent, only to discover that she was actually more qualified than he was to handle the complex financial responsibilities that custody would entail. The systematic exclusion that had seemed so protective and wise now appeared to be the product of Elena's deliberate strategy rather than his superior knowledge and authority. New content. The courtroom fell silent as the full scope of Marcus's miscalculation became apparent to everyone present. He had built his entire custody case on the premise that Elena was financially incompetent, only to discover that she was actually more qualified than he was to handle the complex financial responsibilities that custody would entail. The systematic exclusion that had seemed so protective and wise now appeared to be the product of Elena's deliberate strategy rather than his superior knowledge and authority. Marcus's mother Patricia stared at Elena with a mixture of shock and grudging respect, finally understanding that the daughter-in-law she had dismissed as intellectually inferior actually possessed credentials that exceeded those of anyone in their family. The narrative that had sustained their sense of superiority was crumbling as spectacularly as Marcus's legal case. File edit. Chapter 6.md adding more content to reach the 12,000 character target for Chapter 6 old content. The legal proceedings that Marcus had expected to cement his authority instead revealed the true foundation of his success, and that foundation had been Elena's expertise all along. His fall from prominence to professional exile demonstrated that sustainable success requires genuine competence rather than carefully maintained illusions, and that systematic exclusion of qualified partners ultimately undermines the very achievements such behavior is meant to protect. New content. The legal proceedings that Marcus had expected to cement his authority instead revealed the true foundation of his success, and that foundation had been Elena's expertise all along. His fall from prominence to professional exile demonstrated that sustainable success requires genuine competence rather than carefully maintained illusions, and that systematic exclusion of qualified partners ultimately undermines the very achievements such behavior is meant to protect. Years later, when business students studied the Holloway consulting case as an example of how personal arrogance can destroy professional success, they would marvel at the irony that Marcus had systematically excluded the very expertise that could have saved his career. Elena's methodical documentation of his failures became a textbook example of how thorough preparation and professional integrity always triumph over ego and deliberate ignorance. The transformation was complete. Elena Santos, who had once sat quietly while being dismissed as financially incompetent, now lectured at business schools about ethical accounting practices and the importance of recognizing expertise regardless of its source. Marcus Holloway, who had confidently proclaimed Elena unemployable in open court, discovered that his own professional reputation had been permanently destroyed by the very arrogance that had once seemed to guarantee his success.